Waves of Being. Reflections on Awareness, Illusion and Grace by John Miller. This book is offered freely. May it be of benefit. Copyright 2025 John Miller. This book is offered freely under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. You may copy and share it non-commercially, as long as no changes are made and credit is given to the author. Throughout the writing process, I used ChatGPT as a conversational partner and editorial assistant. While many turns of phrase were shaped in dialogue with the model, the realizations and the responsibility are entirely my own. For more information about the author's non-profit work, All Is Grace Community Partnership Initiative, go to allisgrace.org. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. Tao Te Ching, Chapter 1. Lose yourself in this love. When you lose yourself in this love, you will find everything. Rumi. Preface. How to read this book. Some years ago, I found myself lying in a hospital bed after an event that unravelled everything I thought I knew about myself. There was pain, confusion, and a kind of raw anxiety that left no room for answers. I didn't know it yet, but something had begun to loosen. The realization came slowly, in the days and months that followed, quietly, without effort or intent. All is grace. This book is the long echo of that unfolding. This book is not meant to be read quickly, or even understood in the usual way. It is a meditation disguised as a manuscript, a gesture rather than an argument. You will find no ultimate answers here, only the dissolving of the questions that once seemed so important. The words emerged over time, like ripples on a still pond, sometimes as insight, sometimes as anxiety, sometimes as something unnamed that insisted on being spoken. At the centre of it all is a mystery. The nature of self and the suffering that seems to follow in its wake. What you'll find in these pages is not a system of thought, but an exploration of what happens when thought begins to lose its grip. Scientific metaphors, waves, interference patterns, fields, are not used to explain the soul, but to gesture toward something prior to all explanations. If they serve, use them. If they don't, let them fall away. This book does not require agreement, nor does it demand that you believe anything at all. It only asks that you listen quietly and feel the resonance of what's being pointed to beneath the words. Let the phrases settle. Let the mind wander and return. Let silence be part of the reading. You may find it helpful to approach it as you might a meditation, not by analysing, but by resting with what it offers. I often read this way with texts from Meister Eckhart or the Tao Te Ching. A few lines at a time, followed by silence. Sometimes just a single sentence, then I close the book and sit. You might try that here. Of course, there's nothing wrong with reading it straight through first, letting it wash over you. But if you do return, come slowly. Read less, not more. Sit with what moves you. Let it sink in. In the end, the goal is not to become better, or freer, or more enlightened, but to see clearly that what you already are is not a thing that needs improving. You do not need to follow every chapter in sequence, but there is a gentle unfolding if you do. Return as often as you like. Skip what feels dense. Pause when something strikes you. Let the reading itself become a kind of stillness. Most of all, remember, what you are looking for isn't in this book, but perhaps the book will help you see that it was never anywhere else. Chapter 1. The Seed of the Question. There is often a moment when something begins to loosen. It doesn't arrive with clarity or form, just a shift, barely noticed, almost forgettable. Yet something fundamental has already begun to stir. What once felt complete no longer quite fits, and without intention, a question begins to take shape. Not with words, not even as a conscious thought, more like a background hum that wasn't there before. Something doesn't feel wrong exactly, but it also doesn't feel right. And without knowing what is being asked, the sense of a question begins to grow. The question is not, who am I? Not at first. It is something more vague, less personal, and perhaps more honest. Something is off. That's all. The world continues. Conversations, work, silence, errands all unfold as usual. But underneath it all, a quiet seam appears. A feeling that what once seemed solid is now just a little out of place. Like clothes that have been worn for years and only now feel slightly unfamiliar. The seeking doesn't begin with answers. It doesn't even begin with a clear question. Only with a vague sense that something essential has been missed or mistaken. The frame no longer fits the picture. What had been taken as real no longer feels whole. Over time, there is a shift. Not deliberate, not caused, just a natural turning. What once seemed satisfying begins to fall flat. What once felt whole now feels provisional. And without effort, a kind of noticing begins to unfold. The attention that once faced outward is no longer so captivated. Something looks, not for something else, but at what has always been present. Not as a practice, not as a process, simply because the momentum of looking outward has quieted enough to reveal what had never been hidden. Eventually, and not as a conclusion, something becomes clear. Not intellectually, not through analysis, just with the simplicity of something that has always been true. If it is known to me, it cannot be me. There is no one who realizes this, no event of discovery. The words may appear, but the clarity was already here. Thoughts are seen, emotions too. Even the sense of being someone is recognized, and because it is seen, it cannot be what sees. There is no reward in this. No goal is reached. The old search for understanding no longer applies, and what once promised comfort begins to dissolve. Even the cherished notions of love begin to fall away, not because love is denied, but because it no longer needs to be defined or felt. Not love as a feeling, not love as an act, but love as what does not come or go, what remains when nothing else is held onto. A kind of razor begins to function here, not one that cuts the body, but one that quietly, effortlessly slices through illusion. It was not chosen, it was already present. A native capacity for what is not real to be known as such. Not by thinking, not by deciding, simply by the fact that it is known. This is not philosophy. It is not a framework. It is simply the end of pretending. What once appeared to be identity reveals itself as a reflection. The mirror is not broken, but it no longer claims the image it shows. The story begins to thin. Not through effort, not through spiritual discipline, simply through what is already true. If it is known to me, it cannot be me, and everything is known. Chapter 2. The nature of illusion. Illusion is not a flaw in perception. It is the natural consequence of mistaking the known for the knower. At the centre of every misidentification is a simple inversion. The belief that what is seen, felt, or thought is what we are. This confusion is not resolved by gathering more experience or refining the quality of thought. It is only undone by seeing clearly how awareness takes its own appearances to be its source. In ordinary life, this shows up as identification, with a body, a name, a history, a stream of thought. We say, I am this, meaning this shape, this role, this past. Or, more subtly, this is not me, placing otherness outside of a presumed centre. But if all of these are simply known, then what is the nature of that which knows? The illusion begins when attention turns fully toward content and forgets the knowing itself. Objects and experiences are treated as primary. Sights, sounds, emotions, ideas, each taken as real in themselves, without asking what makes them appear. But these appearances are not random. They move in patterns. Some vanish quickly. Others repeat across moments, lifetimes, even generations. Not because they belong to someone, but because the conditions for their appearance reassert themselves. What is later called karma is not carried. It is echoed. A resonance mistaken for memory. A repetition mistaken for continuity. In this way, the sense of a self seems to arise inside the world, rather than the world appearing within awareness. Even that insight, if held too tightly, can become another layer of identity. The inquiry must remain clean. No new concept can stand in for the truth. The question must be asked without reaching for an answer. Can anything known ever be what I am? This is not abstraction. It is not philosophy. It is the clean cut of a seeing that no longer compromises. The razor begins its work here. If the body is known to me, it cannot be me. If thoughts and emotions are known, they too are not what I am. If space appears, then what sees it must not be inside it. If time moves, what knows that movement must be prior to time. When this is seen, the illusion does not collapse with force. It dissolves, not with resistance, but with the gentleness of a dream falling away. Nothing is lost. Nothing was ever possessed. What is left is not a new self, but the absence of the one who was thought to be there. This absence is not despair. It is not nihilism. It is the silent opening into what has always been true. Awareness untouched by its contents, unaffected by their rise and fall, without form, without location, outside of measure, simply present. And from that clarity, something unexpected appears, not as a mood, not as a perspective, but as a bare fact. All things arise within what you are, not other, not apart, not elsewhere. The illusion was never a lie. It was a lens, a narrowing that gave shape to experience. But now the lens is seen, and the view begins to widen. Chapter 3. The Circle and the Return. Not all journeys move forward. Some move in circles. The usual idea of growth imagines a line, a climb, a ladder. One step leading to the next, always toward more. But the deeper movement, the one that dissolves the illusion of distance, often turns back on itself. What seemed left behind reappears, not because it returns, but because it was never truly gone. What is seen again is not new. only the seeing has changed. This is the circle. And the return is not regression. It is revelation. The self imagines development. It dreams of ascent, of accumulation, of arriving. But what if the clearest seeing comes not through climbing, but through returning? Not to a memory or a phase, but to that unchanging ground that was present before the movement began. What if understanding arises not from forward motion, but from falling still? I was raised within Christianity. The language of grace, the stories of the Gospels, the sense of the sacred. I absorbed them early, though I couldn't have named them then. And like many, I grew away from it. Not out of rebellion, but out of a quiet sense that something wasn't complete. So the path widened. I turned toward science, toward philosophy, toward silence. Buddhism opened new doors. Each step felt like a departure, but it would later be seen as a return. Not to a belief, not to a tradition, but to the clarity that had never left. The structures were breaking apart, but what remained was not lost. It was being uncovered. This is not a metaphor. There was no real movement. What appeared as distance was only attention shifting within what does not move. What seemed to be a path away was simply another form arising in the field. The leaving had never happened. Only the framing had changed. One day, in a small temple, a line appeared in a one Buddhist chanting book. Let me take refuge in the infinite light of my true nature. No explanation was needed, no analysis. It spoke as if from within, a voice not remembered, but never absent. East and west fell away. God and emptiness, silence and presence, all folded into a single clarity. The separation had never been true. The circle did not close. It opened. This was not the arrival at a new belief. It was the dissolving of all distance between what is known and what is. The traditions that once seemed to differ were no longer in opposition. They were the same light, refracted. Not metaphorically, functionally. Different lenses, same radiance. The essence was never contained in the form. To reject what came before is not always necessary. Sometimes it only needs to be re-seen. The old teachings may not have been wrong, only partial. The mistake was not in the symbol, but in the way it was held. What once felt like dogma now appears as gesture. The cross, the Tao, the Dharma wheel, the Enso. Each one circling back to the same source. Not the self refined, the self relinquished. Not a deeper identity, the end of identification. It is like light passing through many filters. The angles vary, but the source does not. And the source is not held in language. It does not belong to any system. It cannot be taught or preserved. It is not a thing. It is not an object of understanding. It is the understanding. There is no more ladder, no more ascent. The journey no longer appears as vertical striving. It is more like a ripple, spreading outward, meeting some invisible boundary, and returning to stillness. Not the same wave, but the same water. To return is not to go backward. To return is to see again, this time without the lens. And in truth, there was no return, because you never truly left. Chapter 4. The Mirror of Experience. Experience is not reality. It is a reflection of reality, shaped by the surface it lands on. Like light on water, what appears depends not only on what is being reflected, but on the condition of the surface. When the water is still, it mirrors the world with clarity. When agitated, it distorts. This is how awareness moves. Thoughts, emotions, and memory ripple the surface. And when certain patterns repeat, when specific frequencies recur and reinforce each other, they begin to interfere. Imagine a shallow tank of water, just a few millimeters deep, lit from above so that even the faintest ripple becomes visible. Beneath the surface, several sources begin to oscillate. On their own, each might barely be noticed, but together, something unexpected emerges. A quiet swelling forms in the water. Not a splash, not a break. Just a soft, persistent shape where the waves align. This is not caused by an object. It arises through constructive interference. A convergence of rhythms that reinforce each other. A coherent shape appears in the medium, not placed there, but formed through resonance. Now imagine this happening in awareness. A thought arises. I'm not enough. Or the world is not safe. Perhaps it starts as a faint ripple. But over time, with repetition, emotion, memory, and reinforcement, it becomes stable. It persists. It holds its shape. It becomes a standing wave. This is the beginning of ego. Not a person, not a self. A region of coherent interference. An energetic pattern that endures. It feels solid because it stays. But it is not a thing. It is not separate from the medium in which it forms. It is simply a persistent alignment of waves. The ego is not a mistake. It is not an invader. It is a resonance, an echo, a habit of attention and belief that has gained temporary structure. The same resonance, extended and deepened, can take the shape of trauma. It can echo as karma. It can express itself as identity. None of these are stored as objects. They are not fixed within the body or buried in the past. They are held as patterns, waves that reinforce each other until they form a visible distortion in the field. And just as they arise through repetition, they dissolve when conditions change. If even one of the contributing waveforms fades, the coherence weakens. If the rhythm is interrupted, the shape loses strength. The pattern begins to unravel. The water smooths itself, not through control, but through the natural fading of reinforcement. This is how healing happens. Not by digging or fixing, not by suppressing or denying, but by no longer feeding the rhythm. Presence, not pressure. Seeing, not solving. Allowing, not adjusting. As long as the resonance holds, every new experience is shaped by it. Each perception bends around it. Like light through a lens, everything is touched. Every interaction passes through the distortion. And because it feels familiar, it feels like self. But it isn't. It is just a temporary knot. And the knot cannot be undone by force. You cannot flatten a resonance by pushing. You cannot silence a frequency by shouting over it. The field must be allowed to rest. The old patterns must be permitted to fade. And they will. Because they were never solid. They were never separate. They were only waves. This is not a theory. It is the physics of awareness. When the interference quiets, what was always here begins to reflect clearly. You do not need a perfectly smooth surface. You only need to stop feeding the noise. Let the wave pass. Let the field rest. Let what remains reflect what has always been. Chapter 5. The Edge of the Razor. The mirror shows. The razor cuts. There comes a point on the inward path when softness alone is not enough. The warmth of presence, the gentleness of allowing, the healing of old patterns may remain for a while. But eventually, something deeper is called for. Not another experience, not another practice. Clarity. Not poetic, not emotional. Precise, clean, unflinching. This is the edge of the razor. Not a weapon, a tool. Not for harm, but for seeing. In traditions that value inquiry, such as Advaita Vedanta, Zen, and early Buddhism, the razor appears again and again. It takes different names such as neti neti, koan, anatta, and sunyata. But the principle is the same. Strip away what is not essential, and what remains is what has always been true. You are not the body. You are not the thoughts. You are not the emotions. You are not the roles, the memories, the story. These are appearances in awareness, ephemeral, familiar, sometimes beautiful, but not what you are. And this is not a belief. It is something to be seen. The edgeless razor makes this seeing possible. Not by building up, but by taking away. Not out of rejection, but out of precision. A quiet, surgical honesty. If it is known to me, it cannot be me. This is not a statement to contemplate. It is a principle to apply. And when applied without compromise, it does not flinch. The razor cuts again. Not that either. The sense of identity begins to loosen. What once felt solid becomes transparent. The waveforms of belief lose their coherence. The surface of awareness begins to still. Eventually, there is nothing left to hold. No ground, just silence. And yet, you are still here, present, aware. Not as a thing, but as awareness itself. At first, this can feel terrifying. The edge is sharp. It slices through every identity that has ever been worn, every belief, every anchor, even the one who appears to search. But what remains is not absence, it is freedom. Freedom not as a feeling, but as the absence of bondage, a natural lightness, an effortlessness, because nothing false is being held up anymore. There is no one left to pretend, no one left to defend, no one left to maintain. You are no longer navigating the dream. You are awake within it. This is the function of the razor. It is not cruel, but it is exacting. You cannot bring anything with you here, not even spiritual insight, especially not spiritual insight. The moment you say, "Now I understand," the razor asks, "Do you?" And it cuts again, until nothing is left to grasp. And in the absence of grasping, something begins to dawn. Quietly, without ceremony. You have always been what you were looking for. Unnameable, ungraspable, already whole. Standing on the edge of the razor. And the razor keeps going. It does not stop at identity. It continues through belief, through culture, through spiritual teaching. Even the purest pointer can become another veil. The razor does not argue. It simply reveals. And what is revealed must be known directly. If it cannot be seen for yourself, it is not yours to carry. Chapter 6. Waves within awareness. Awareness is not static. It does not sit apart, watching from a distance. It flows. It pulses. It breathes with the rhythm of experience. Each impression, thought, sensation, and emotion is not separate from the field. It is the field, stirred into movement. Like wind across water, these movements ripple outward. They meet, they collide, they interact. In some moments, they pass quickly. In others, they stabilize. From this stabilization, patterns arise. And from persistent patterning, identity is imagined. But awareness itself does not change. It is not the ripples. It is not the patterns. It is not the image dancing across the surface. It is the field itself, quietly present, silent, and undisturbed by any fluctuation. The ego, as already seen, is not a thing, but a loop, a self-reinforcing swirl of thought and memory, a standing wave. Trauma is its deeper echo, not a wound buried in the body, but a frequency held by habit, a resonance made sticky by repetition. To see this clearly is to return to the field. Awareness has no center, no edge, no boundary. Every moment of experience arises within it, not in space or time, but in immediacy. A sensation appears, a thought follows, then memory, then silence. And through all of it, the field remains. Now, imagine a portion of that field beginning to constrict, not through effort or force, but through entanglement. Thoughts loop, emotions circle, sensations repeat. What was once fluid begins to tighten. A knot is formed, not a mass, but a localized coherence, a region of tension within the vastness. This knot distorts. Like a bulge in the surface of still water, it bends everything that passes through it. A word is heard, and pain is triggered. Silence is felt as threat. The present is no longer seen clearly. It is filtered through what came before. And the distortion does not remain contained. It is projected. Meaning is assigned. Intent is imagined. The knot interprets the world and sees itself reflected back. We believe someone has wronged us, that there is a person, a will, a plan behind the disturbance. But what if there is no one behind the action? What if there is only another region of coherence, another swelling in the field, another resonance moving according to its own inherited pattern? What if the one who appears to harm is, in that moment, simply another knot, responding as all interference does, by reinforcing itself? Then forgiveness is no longer a moral achievement. It is a natural consequence of seeing clearly. There is no one to blame, no self to accuse. Only overlapping perturbations in a shared field. And from that clarity, equanimity arises, not as a cultivated attitude, but as a return to what was already here when the distortion falls away. And still the loop continues. Perception leads to reaction. Reaction reinforces perception. This is not a punishment. It is not a verdict. It is resonance, feedback, interference. The field perturbs itself. This is karma, not as justice, not as law, but as physics, as echo. Healing does not erase these patterns, it allows them to soften. Not through correction or effort, but through the end of reinforcement. When even one contributing frequency begins to fade, the knot loosens. Not because it is fixed, because it was never solid to begin with. The memory remains. The event is not undone, but the contraction is no longer taken as identity. It is like a muscle that has forgotten how to relax. The psyche holds itself around the injury, and the holding is mistaken for self. But truly, it is only tension, a narrowing of awareness around a disturbance. To heal is not to solve the knot, nor to erase it. It is to allow space around it, to stop feeding its rhythm, to cease identifying with the resonance that once defined everything. And in that allowing, something returns. Not a new quality, not a new state. Simply the restoration of flow, fluidity, grace. The effortless unfolding of awareness when it is no longer bound. When the waves are no longer held, they pass freely. And from that freedom, a different kind of knowing appears. Not conceptual, not constructed. A clarity that does not require control. A peace that does not require opposition. Not the peace of resolution, the peace of no longer needing to grasp. This is the grace of the field. It is not given, it is not earned. It is what remains when the distortion is no longer believed. Awareness does not resist what appears within it. It only reflects. And when nothing is clung to, what remains is what has always been. Still, unbound, whole. Chapter 7. Interference and the Ego. In a shallow tank of water, several vibrating sources are placed around the edge. Each one generates ripples across the surface. These waves meet, overlap, and interact. Where their rhythms align and the interference becomes constructive, a pattern emerges. A standing wave. A region of resonance. This resonance is not an object. It is a zone of coherence. A temporary convergence of motion where multiple signals reinforce one another just long enough to seem stable. It appears central. It draws the eye. But it has no core. It is not a thing. It is an echo that holds its shape while the conditions support it. This is the ego. Not a self, not a center, not a subject at the heart of experience. It is a persistence, a pattern, a standing wave formed through the convergence of thought, memory, sensation, language, desire, fear. These do not coalesce into a self. They cohere into a resonance. That resonance appears in the field of awareness, and attention gathers around it. Meaning is assigned. Ownership is presumed. And so the pattern is mistaken for a person. The appearance of continuity is mistaken for identity. The resonance is called me. But the water remains unchanged. The surface may ripple, but the depth is undisturbed. Awareness is not broken by the appearance of form. It does not need to push away distortion. It does not need to guard its clarity. It reflects every appearance without being altered. The arising of a pattern does not confirm the existence of an essence. The field is not transformed by what moves within it. It only seems that way when attention narrows. When the ripple is mistaken for reality, when the brightness of coherence convinces the mind, there must be something solid at its source. This is the illusion of selfhood. The sense of being a centre is itself a ripple, a temporary coordination of inputs. It feels stable because it repeats. It feels central because attention is pulled toward it. Experience warps around it, and what is seen is interpreted through the lens of preservation, of separation, of continuity. But this lens is not reliable. Every attempt to prove the self, to defend it, to preserve its structure, sends another wave into the field. These waves reinforce the pattern. The knot tightens. The appearance of solidity strengthens. This is karma. Not as moral judgment or cosmic reckoning, but as continuation. Pattern feeding pattern. Reaction reinforcing distortion. Every identification is a resonance held in place by repetition. Every defense strengthens the appearance. But coherence is not truth. It is only sustained rhythm, and even the most enduring pattern can fade when conditions change. The unravelling does not require destruction. It does not require violence. The pattern dissolves when even one input shifts. A belief softens. A thought passes without capture. A pause arises in the usual rhythm. That is enough. The alignment loosens. The waves no longer reinforce. The resonance weakens. The swelling fades. And what remains is stillness. Nothing was lost because there was never a thing to lose. Only a rhythm that no longer holds. The field remains whole, quiet, spacious. And when the resonance of ego dissolves, it is not replaced by something truer. There is no truer self waiting behind the false one. There is only the field. The water that never moved. Clarity, silence, awareness. Not claimed, not constructed, not grasped. This is not annihilation. It is rest. Not the destruction of identity, but the recognition that identity was never more than a standing wave. What remains is what never left. Awareness, untouched by motion, reflecting all, needing nothing. Interlude, the shape of a life. Karma is not judgment. It is not punishment. It is not reward. It is pattern. Not as fate, but as formation. Not moral, but vibrational. Every reaction, every unloved wound, every unfinished thought, each one leaves a trace, a groove in the field of awareness. And when the conditions match, the pattern replays. Not because you failed, but because the resonance is still available. This is individual karma. The shape a life begins to take when interference becomes habit. You do not need belief in past lives to see it. You only need to look clearly at your own. How many times have you stood in the same argument, felt the same ache, heard the same voice in your mind, lived the same longing? It is not personal. It is mechanical. Karma is not stored in time. It is carried by memory. It moves through story. It clings where clarity is absent. But in the moment of seeing, when the wave is met from stillness, something shifts. The pattern is not erased. It is unheld. There is no need to rewrite the past, only to stop repeating it. And when that happens, you begin to move from presence, not from history. You begin to act from clarity, not conditioning. This is the beginning of freedom, not from life, but from the false self who lives it. Chapter 8. Grace and Coherence. Coherence is not control. It is not the result of force or intention. It is alignment through resonance, the natural convergence of rhythms into an appearance of unity. In physics, coherence occurs when waves reinforce one another instead of cancelling. Phases align. Light that once scattered becomes a laser. Sound that once wavered becomes a tone. What was once noise becomes signal. It becomes meaning. In awareness, coherence moves in the same way. It is not imposed stillness or organized thought. It is not the management of experience. It is the quiet synchrony that arises when resistance ceases. When thoughts, sensations, perceptions and memories move freely through the field without collision or grasping. When nothing is held, coherence unfolds. This is grace, not as a gift, not as reward, but as the natural rhythm of awareness left unobstructed. In the shallow tank of the mind, waves are always moving. Most rise and fall without leaving a trace, but now and then patterns align. A shape appears, Reinforced by interference, it holds for a while. It feels stable. It feels central. It is mistaken for self. But the grace is not in the resonance. It is not in the coherence. It is in the field that permits the pattern and remains unchanged when it fades. Grace is the condition for coherence, not its outcome. It is the silent intelligence that does not direct, but allows. The clarity beneath form. The stillness behind movement. The openness that holds without containing. When thought, feeling, perception, and memory fall into resonance, it does not happen through strategy. It does not respond to demand. It arises by release. And when it arises, grace becomes visible. Not because it was created, but because the obscuration was removed. The silence was already here. It is not an achievement. It is what remains when the effort stops. There is no triumph in this. No one succeeds. There is only a loosening, a letting go. And as the pattern dissolves, what once appeared as self releases without regret. The surface calms. The mirror clears. Grace does not require perfection. It does not demand the absence of disturbance. It requires only a willingness to meet the moment without defense. Not an ideal moment, the real one, with its edges, with its weight. Grace is not earned by becoming better. It is revealed by becoming honest. And even when the shape disperses, the field remains. The wavefront scatters, the rhythm fades, but the space that receives it never breaks. Dispersion can be graceful too, when there is no resistance. The field does not fragment, it includes. The ego seeks coherence through control. It mimics grace by imposing order. It tries to command stillness. But stillness cannot be held. It cannot be arranged. It comes when awareness listens rather than speaks. It comes when there is no one left to manage the wave. Grace is not something given. It is not something found. It is what you return to when you stop trying to return. It is not the result of achievement. It is the softening into openness. Like a flock of starlings moving as one, not because they are directed, but because the sky is open and the rhythm is shared. To live in grace is to stop holding the shape. To move in openness is to let the wave carry itself. And in that movement, the illusion of identity fades. What remains is the field shining through. Clarity without control. Form without fixation. Self as pattern, not essence. As dance, not substance. This is grace. This is presence. This is the wave returned to light. But ideas alone do not dissolve resistance. Insight must meet experience. Interlude, the neighbour and the millpond. These insights are not confined to formal inquiry. They echo through the small moments of daily life, often when nothing outwardly significant seems to be happening. You are sitting in the evening. The breath is slow. The body is still. Awareness rests without resistance. The field is undisturbed. Then, through the wall, a television bursts into sound. Loud, sudden, the body tightens. Thoughts arise in sequence, nearly invisible. They are doing it again. Don't they care? Can't they see I am trying to rest? A quiet storm of meaning begins to form. This is unfair. This should not be happening. I should not have to feel this. It feels like disturbance, but the disturbance is not the television. It is the wave of response arising in the field of awareness. The event outside meets a pattern inside. A resonance forms. The contraction is not personal. It is not the decision of a separate self. It is a pattern, a frequency shaped by memory and tension. What appears to be them is not different in kind. Their noise, their behaviour, their insensitivity are also patterns, also resonance, shaped by fatigue, distraction, conditioning. There is no solid self choosing to disrupt. No one controlling the moment from behind the curtain. Just patterns arising, interacting, reinforcing or dissolving, depending on what meets what. The image of blame appears, but has no substance behind it. The reaction is not incorrect. It is simply not owned. To see this clearly is not to justify what happened. It is to see what actually happened. The event met a knot in the field. That knot took shape as suffering. And yet, in the moment of clear seeing, the knot begins to loosen. Not through an act of will, not through practice, but because there is nothing solid left to defend. The resistance no longer makes sense. The wave passes. The contraction softens. And suffering begins to fade. This is not a moral shift. It is not the result of trying to be more compassionate. Forgiveness begins to arise, but not as a decision. It emerges as a consequence of understanding. Compassion appears, but not as a virtue. It is the natural response of a field no longer confused. What wanted to tighten now releases. The stillness begins to return, not through effort, but through balance reasserting itself. The image is like a millpond. Disturbed, it holds every tremor, but left alone, it settles. The surface smooths. The distortion fades. And what remains is what was always beneath it. A single drop of oil can still the surface of water, not because it controls it, but because it interrupts the spread of motion. In the same way, your clear seeing acts on the field. It does not dominate it. It stops feeding the turbulence. What you see through, you no longer sustain. And in that quiet, everything around you begins to quiet too. The event may continue. The sound may still rise and fall, but you are no longer amplifying the pattern. And if a boundary must be drawn, if a conversation must take place, it does not arise from resentment. It moves from clarity, not as self-protection, not as control, just the field adjusting its contours, just awareness readjusting to resonance that no longer holds. There is no longer a need to oppose, no need to be right. The separation dissolves. The story dissolves. The disturbance dissolves. The mirror returns to stillness, and nothing needed to be fixed. Chapter 9. Collective Karma and the World. A single drop disturbs the surface. But what happens when countless drops fall at once? What if disturbance echoes not through one small region, but across the entire field? Just as a single thought can generate interference within personal awareness, collective thought forms create resonance that shapes the shared experience of the world. Nations, ideologies, economies, these are not formed only from policies or bricks. They arise from repetition, from memory and belief, from trauma transmitted between generations, from patterns sustained by fear and agreement. Awareness is not divided. What contracts in one region of the field ripples into others. When resonance stabilizes across multiple points of awareness, its influence spreads. A coherent distortion appears, not in one mind, but in the shared medium. It appears as history, as culture, as ideology. It appears as war. This is collective karma, not fate, not judgment. It is interference made stable through repetition. War is karma in resonance. So is systemic oppression. So is the recurring hunger for control. These are not isolated eruptions. They are the result of patterns held in place by memory, trauma, and belief. They are coherence, formed not through clarity, but through fear. They emerge because the conditions for reinforcement remain in place. Look closely at this moment in time. The rise of fascism in multiple democracies, the resurgence of religious fundamentalism, the return of ideological violence and genocidal conflict. These are not new problems. They are not disconnected events. They are the convergence of old patterns repeating. Interference made dense through collective reinforcement. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example, is not merely political. It is karmic resonance. Generations locked in reactive coherence. Trauma inherited. Pain remembered. Narratives repeated until the pattern becomes indistinguishable from identity. We act again and again as though the pattern is real, as though it is who we are. And in doing so, we regenerate it. The illusion of separation gives rise to judgment, to accusation, to blame. But beneath the appearance of conflict, there is no separate agent. There is resonance, generational trauma echoing across time, patterns repeating, not because they are true, but because they are familiar. And so the only true forgiveness is not personal. It is awareness forgiving itself for having believed the illusion of division. As A Course in Miracles suggests, forgiveness is not something granted by one person to another. It is the undoing of the belief that separation ever occurred. But the illusion does not stop at the surface. The resonance is not only mistaken for a self, it is mistaken for a doer. This gives rise to the ancient question: if there is no self, how do consequences unfold? How does life respond to action? Traditional teachings often describe karma as an imprint carried across lifetimes, held by a soul or subtle body. But this model depends on the assumption of continuity, a self that persists through time. Yet, under direct scrutiny, that continuity dissolves. There is no stable entity to carry the imprint, no container to hold the memory. If what we call self is nothing more than a temporary resonance, then karma is not carried. It is not inherited by a person. It is the pattern itself, a repeating waveform within awareness, a rhythm that reappears when the conditions align. Reincarnation in this light need not refer to the migration of a soul. It can be seen as the reappearance of familiar patterns. The body is new, the name is new, but the conditions echo. The resonance returns. The person is not reborn. The pattern is reformed. Awareness encounters itself again through similar interference. Karma ends not through the accumulation of virtue, not through cosmic rebalancing. It ends through the dissolution of identification. The field ceases to sustain the pattern, and so the pattern fades. The waveform collapses. The distortion clears. There is no self left to carry karma forward. There is only awareness, remembering its own stillness. If the ego is a region of coherence, then so are its decisions, its fears, its aggressions. The horrors of history and the longing for peace both arise as patterns, not as the acts of separate agents. There is no will behind them, only resonance. There is identification with form. There is alignment with distortion. And from this identification, action is born. But what acts is not a self. What moves is a pattern. And so we assign blame. We take credit. Rewrite stories about what is simply interference, repeated, reinforced, amplified by participation on a mass scale. The world we see is not a fixed stage. It is the shape of shared resonance. When enough people believe in scarcity, systems of deprivation appear. When enough people believe in separation, borders harden. When enough people defend identity, war arises. But none of this is permanent. The waveform that holds fascism in place is no more substantial than a single thought of unworthiness. It endures only because it is sustained. Institutions repeat it. Individuals obey it. The field responds with coherence, and the pattern holds. To live from presence is to withdraw that coherence. To see clearly is to stop reinforcing the illusion. To rest in awareness is to stop contributing to the not. This is the quiet revolution. It is not a struggle against others. It is the end of struggle itself. The personal is collective. The collective is personal. When you meet your own pattern with clarity, when you remain present in the face of repetition, you become a point of stillness. Not visibly, not loudly, but unmistakably. The ocean does not change with one ripple. But it cannot remain unchanged if every ripple begins to shift. This is not destiny. This is not fate. It is interference. And this is its resolution. The remembering of silence, the refusal to collapse, the choice to remain clear. Even one field cleared becomes a mirror. Even one being resting in awareness becomes a tuning fork. And others feel it. And others remember. And the wave begins to change again. Interlude. Why this matters. This is not an argument for detachment. It is not a suggestion to turn away from pain or to silence thought. It is not about rising above discomfort or cultivating distance. It matters because suffering is not abstract. It is immediate. It appears in the tightening of the chest when words land with unintended force. It surfaces in the shame that follows failure to meet an image of who you think you should be. It lingers in the background of every search for relief that never fully arrives. Suffering is not conceptual. It is patterned energy moving through the field of awareness, often unnoticed until it is already shaping perception. These patterns of resistance, grasping, fear, and defense are not flaws. They are waves. Temporary disturbances. Coherences that arise from repetition and habit then are mistaken for truth. The insight offered here, returned to gently throughout, is that awareness itself is never disturbed. The field remains intact. Even when the surface is stirred, it does not break. Awareness is not wounded. It does not fragment. It reflects what arises without becoming what arises. Why does that matter? Because it is possible to live from that knowing, not to transcend life, but to meet it without clinging, to walk through heartbreak, fear, and uncertainty with clarity rather than control, to recognize your own contraction not as failure, but as another ripple, to see your reflection even in the face of someone who triggers anger or resistance. Not because it is a noble practice, not because it is a cultivated perspective, but because nothing is separate. This recognition does not need to change what happens. It changes how it is seen, and in that seeing, the old structure of suffering begins to dissolve. Even when the circumstances remain the same, something shifts. There is no longer the need to fix the surface. There is simply the return to what never moved. Chapter 10. The Disruption of Knowing. To know is to fix in place, to name, to freeze a moment in conceptual amber and mistake it for what is. This is the gift of language, and also its trap. It allows us to navigate form, to organize and respond, but it blinds us to the formless. Knowledge is a function of pattern recognition. It is what allows us to make tea, drive a car, remember a face. But beneath its usefulness lies a quiet seduction, the belief that what we know is what exists, that what we can describe is what is true, that what we remember is what happened. But what if knowing is itself a collapse? Not metaphorically, but experientially. When awareness rests in openness, it receives without grasping. There is no need to interpret, label, or conclude. But when thought is believed, when a story is repeated, or a concept adhered to, the wave collapses into something solid, something called certain. The moment we know someone, whether as friend, partner, or adversary, we stop meeting them. What appears in their place is no longer a presence, but a label. The living reality is replaced by an internal summary. This collapse is subtle. It often feels like safety, like clarity. It gives a sense of control, but it cuts off the pulse of being. Knowing says, I have seen this before. Awareness says, this has never been. The disruption of knowing begins when this habit is seen for what it is. When the machinery of interpretation slows, even briefly, and a breath of not knowing enters. It may come through grief, through awe, through wonder, or exhaustion. But when it comes, it clears. Things become vivid, not because they are understood, but because there is no longer the effort to understand. Perception is no longer filtered through the lens of history. The moment is no longer being compared. The mind resists this. It confuses not knowing with ignorance, with danger, with incompetence. But to abide in not knowing is not to be without intelligence. It is to be without projection. It is to meet life as mystery, without shrinking from it. In trauma, knowing becomes a defense. The world must be predictable because unpredictability once hurt. The body tenses around assumptions. The mind anticipates and explains. But this knowing is not clarity. It is compensation. It is a strategy that once served, but now contracts. And healing begins not by finding new answers, but by allowing a different wave to move through. To disrupt knowing is not to abandon intelligence. It is to use thought without being used by it. It is to hold concepts lightly, knowing they are tools, not truth. It is to let awareness re-expand beyond the architecture of belief. A thought is not a fact. A memory is not an authority. An interpretation is not the real. Knowing is a form of contraction. It draws tight around uncertainty and names it. But what is named is no longer seen, and so knowing must be gently interrupted. Inquiry serves this function, not to replace false beliefs with better ones, but to reveal the spaciousness they conceal. The edgeless razor does not slice toward new conclusions. It removes what never held. When a belief is examined and seen through, it does not resolve into another belief. It dissolves. And what remains is not an answer. It is openness. And in that openness, something becomes visible. Not as content, as presence. Not as knowledge, as love. To know is to end the movement. To not know is to join it, to become it. This is the disruption of knowing, not through rejection, not through argument, but through grace. It is the gentle unravelling of the one who sought. The end of the question, not because clarity was found, but because it was no longer required. The entire structure of meaning relaxes. The pressure to resolve lifts. And in that absence, light is no longer directed. It simply shines. There is no concept left to guard, no edge to defend. Awareness remains, quiet and whole. Not as an object, not as an entity, simply as the space in which everything was already moving, already appearing, already dissolving. Chapter 11. Silence and the Substance of Love. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the absence of noise. Not the noise of the world, but the internal commentary that endlessly positions the self, interprets meaning, asserts opinion, and filters reality through the need to grasp or defend. Silence is not blankness, it is fullness. It is not empty of content, it is free from contraction. It is the depth that holds all thought, without being defined by any of it. When speech stops, silence may first appear as lack, as void. But if listened to closely, it reveals itself not as absence, but as presence. What it contains is not soundlessness, but a quiet aliveness that asks for nothing. And within that presence, something begins to be known. Not through the senses, not through thought, not even through feeling in the ordinary sense. It is the subtle hum beneath all form, the stillness in which all movement arises and returns. It is what permits everything to appear. It makes no demand. It does not announce itself, but it is always here. This is love, not as emotion, not as warmth, not as longing or bond. Love, in its truest expression, is the field itself, the open capacity in which preference dissolves, the substance of awareness before it organizes into identity. Love is not something we do. It is what remains when doing ends. We confuse it with care, with attraction, with the wish to hold or be held. But these are surface waves. Love is the water. It was during a quiet moment, reading Rumi's Lose Yourself, that this insight first cut through. Not as poetic inspiration, but as direct seeing. That the loss of self is not erasure, but return. And what it returns to is not lack, but love. Not something added, something remembered. The poem did not ask for renunciation. It invited a kind of remembering that unknots the grasping mind. Silence is the gateway to this remembrance. Not the silence of control or withdrawal, but the silence that comes when no defense is held in place. It is the end of the need to prove or protect. The dissolution of the identity that speaks for approval or fights for its place. This silence is not passive. It is presence. It is not repression. It is spaciousness. It is the natural return of the field to stillness, when no new resistance is introduced. Just as ripples fade on the surface of water when no new stone is thrown, awareness tends towards stillness when it is no longer disturbed. Love, then, is not a feeling that must be cultivated. It is what arises when interference ends. It is not the product of effort, but the condition revealed when the self loosens. The same is true of compassion. It does not arise through moral training or spiritual posture. It emerges when the illusion of separation dissolves. When the false self is quiet, what remains is not indifference. It is gentle presence It receives without boundary. It knows without object. We imagine silence to be something hidden, something beneath thought, beneath the activity of the world. But silence is not buried under appearances. It is what remains when appearances are no longer clung to. It is not created. It is revealed. When the machinery of knowing slows, silence remains. When grasping ceases, silence appears. But it is not dull. It is not inert. It is alive, not with content, but with presence. A knowing that requires no name. A wholeness that asks for nothing. And in that silence, love becomes visible, not as an experience, not as emotion, but as substance. Love is not what we feel. It is what we are when separation falls away. It is not something exchanged between beings. It is the absence of the imagined boundary between them. We look for love in others, in belonging, in meaning, but it was never missing. It is the intimacy beneath all forms, only obscured when the self stands in the way. Love has no opposite because it is not a reaction. It is not preference. It is what appears when there is no division. It is not quietude. It is the stillness of the self. To sit in silence is not to leave the world. It is to return to what never left. It is not emptiness, but fullness that no longer needs to be claimed. The deepest peace is not the absence of thought. It is the absence of the one who thinks. In that absence, the heart does not open towards something else. It simply no longer closes. The mirror clears. The boundary dissolves. And what appeared as other is revealed to be the same field, moving in a different rhythm. What appeared as self becomes transparent. Compassion arises from this transparency, not as a choice, not as a value, but as what remains when nothing divides. There is no longer the effort to bridge a gap. There is no hierarchy to flatten, just the simple clarity that sees no distance. And when the grasping mind releases, when the defended heart relaxes, silence is no longer something to find. It is what you are. We do not create silence. We stop obscuring it. And in that moment, love is remembered, not as feeling, as being. The world continues its noise. Waves rise and crash. People struggle. Systems harm. But beneath it all, silence remains. It does not need to overcome. It needs only to be felt. To rest in that silence is not to turn away. It is to return. To let action come, not from reaction, but from stillness. To move without being moved. Love is not a response. It is what sees without dividing. It is not something shared. It is what is already shared, before the mind draws lines. In silence, there is nothing to attain. There is only what has always been. And what has always been is love. Awareness as love, as silence, as itself. Chapter 12. The End of the Wave. There is no wave, not truly. There is only awareness modulating. We speak of waves because we perceive patterns, apparent fluctuations within a field of experience that seem to carry information, identity, memory, and agency. But these are not objective realities. They are artifacts of perspective. The wave is not an entity. It is a metaphor for coherence, the arising of apparent form within the formless. Earlier, we examined how the ego could be understood as a swelling in a shallow tank, a localized coherence formed through the constructive interference of overlapping waveforms. In that analogy, each waveform represents a frequency of thought, emotion, memory, or belief. When particular frequencies align, a pattern arises. The swelling appears. A shape seems to form. And that shape is mistaken for a self. But this coherence is fragile. Shift even one frequency, and what once appeared solid begins to dissolve. The shape fades. The illusion dissipates. What seemed to be an enduring entity is revealed to be temporary and contingent. Not a being, but a pattern. This is the nature of all phenomena arising in awareness, including the sense of self, the sense of will, the feeling of continuity, and the illusion of agency. None of these are stable structures. They are resonances. They persist only while the conditions that support them are sustained. When those conditions shift, the resonance collapses. And with it goes the appearance of a someone who was acting or choosing. The coherence was never personal. It was never owned. So what becomes of karma, of action and consequence? These too are revealed to be impersonal. The apparent actions taken by apparent individuals arise from misidentification, the belief that the coherent pattern is real and autonomous. But the resonance is not making decisions. It is being expressed. It is not doing anything. It is being done by the impersonal dynamics of awareness, shaped by past impressions, language, culture, trauma, and conditioning. There is no actor. There is only movement. And just as resonance arises when conditions align, it disappears when those conditions shift. Karma, then, is not something to be burned or transcended. It is simply resonance that ceases when no longer reinforced. Ego is not an entity that needs to be destroyed. It is coherence, no longer holds. This is the end of the wave, the quiet dissipation of a pattern when its sustaining inputs are no longer present. It is not an event. It is not a spiritual achievement. It is a natural unfolding. When interference ends, the pattern dissolves. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be overcome. There is only the soft return to equilibrium. Even this book is a resonance, a pattern formed by conditions, insight, memory, language, and attention, all briefly aligned to give it shape. But like every appearance in the field, it too will subside. It has no lasting essence. It is not the truth. It is not what remains. The mind may resist this. It wants resolution. It wants closure. But the wave does not end in conclusion. It ends in dissolution, not into absence, but into what was always prior. The physicists call it equilibrium, the heat death of the universe, when energy is evenly distributed and all movement ceases. Not annihilation, but stillness. Not loss, but completion. In the same way, the spiritual path ends not in victory, but in silence. When every contraction fades, when no interference remains, what is left is not emptiness. It is undisturbed presence. It is the sea, not the storm. You were not born. You do not die. What you are is not the wave. It is the field itself. The wave appears. It plays. It ends. But nothing has been lost, because nothing was ever separate. The story of self, the story of seeking, the story of awakening, these are all motions across the surface. And now, in this moment, the surface no longer reacts. The resonance fades. Even here, in clarity, waves may still arise, not because they belong to anyone, because awareness continues to move. The field does not resist the wave. It does not identify with it. It reflects what appears without grasping, without echo, without confusion. This is not nihilism. It is not erasure. It is presence without distortion, awareness without contraction, form without identity. The end of the wave is not the end of experience. It is the end of misperception. It is the end of believing that what arises is who you are. And from here, life may continue. But it will not be lived by a self. It will move as it always has, spontaneous, transparent, ungrasped. The wave has ended, and what remains is what was always here, the unbroken sea. Interlude, the karma of no one. Karma is chanted more often than it is questioned. Many accept the doctrine. Few pause to look beneath its surface. And perhaps that is why it endures. Its contradictions remain hidden with reverence, covered by repetition. For a time, I too accepted it, but something never sat right. The core teachings of Advaita Vedanta were luminous. They pointed directly to the unreality of the separate self, the primacy of awareness, and the possibility of recognition, here and now. These teachings did not ask for belief. They asked for inquiry. Every statement could be tested. Every insight could be verified in experience. Except one: karma. It stood apart. It explained suffering and continuity across lifetimes, but it offered no means of direct seeing. There was no pointer, no razor, no experiential test. You could accept it or reject it, but not see it for yourself. And that broke something. It interrupted the directness that had defined the path until then. Because if the self is not real, what exactly continues? If there is no doer, how can there be consequence? If all form arises within awareness, who carries the weight? The doctrine denied the ego in principle, then reintroduced it in mystery. Karma became a metaphysical remainder, assigned to a subtle body, or a soul, or a structure left unnamed. But if the self is an illusion, no part of it can persist. No echo remains if the form was never separate. So I looked again. What began to emerge was a reframing. Karma begins to make sense when we stop assigning it to a self. As Chong and Su Nim once described, karma is energy and information. This may sound abstract, but it is precise. Energy is motion, fluctuation, wave. Information, in formation, is that which gives shape. It is the arising of pattern within the field, not in the world, but in mind, in the place where naming and knowing occur. Outside the mind, there is only energy, no form, no story, no karma. Karma is not a law imposed from without. It is a resonance. It is what happens when energy is shaped by memory and thought. Karma does not move through time as a possession. It moves as a waveform, a pattern that propagates through the field of awareness. Sometimes it travels freely. Sometimes it entangles. When it meets a region of coherence, a knot of memory, belief, or identification, it amplifies. Resonance forms. A sense of self appears. A life is imagined. The wave condenses into story. This is ego. Not a soul, but a tangle. Not a traveller, but a knot in the field. And here is the essential point. The same karmic wave can entangle with many apparent selves. This is why we speak of past lives, future lives, generational trauma, collective karma. Not because the same person continues, but because the same wave finds resonance wherever the conditions match. There is no metaphysical traveller. Continuity is not proof of self. It is proof of entanglement. And entanglement happens only in form, only in the conceptualizing mind. Wherever awareness constricts around identification, the karmic wave appears. It becomes a fate, a burden, a self. But when seen clearly, when not mistaken for identity, the structure softens. The wave may still pass through, but it is no longer personal, no longer mine, no longer yours, just movement within the field. From the standpoint of awareness, the language of past and future lives is not wrong, it is simply incomplete. There are lives, but they are not lived by selves. They are lived by awareness, modulating, entangling, expressing, not as a flame passed from one candle to the next, but as fire itself, catching where conditions allow. This view does not deny the beauty some find in the idea of a soul's journey. It does not mock the story of learning, growth, or return, but it points to something deeper. Even without a self, there is still unfolding. There is still intelligence, still love. Nothing real is lost, only the illusion of ownership. No soul travels, no entity returns, only resonance. And eventually, not even that, because the wave itself was never separate from the field. And when no identification remains, what appeared as pattern becomes transparent. The field reflects, but it does not cling. It expresses, but it does not carry. Even physics hints at this. At the smallest scales, what we call particles behave like waves. They are probability fields, not fixed things. They do not take shape until observed. And observation alters what is seen. Measurement changes the system. There is no independent object. Interaction defines outcome. In quantum theory, even at a distance, entangled particles behave as one. They are not separate, even when far apart. The physicist seeks a unified field, an underlying whole from which all form arises. What if that field is not merely physical? What if it is awareness itself? Not personal awareness, not human thought, but the silent capacity from which fluctuation, coherence, and form appear. The mystic and the physicist describe the same thing, each in a different dialect. One with mathematics, one with silence. What matters is not the language, but the seeing. This wave theory is not just metaphor. It is not poetry layered onto experience. It is how things appear when grasping ends, when identity loosens, when the contraction that calls itself me no longer needs to hold its shape. What has long been intuited begins to feel visible. The structure softens. The field becomes still. The wave was never broken. It never needed to be healed. What looked like fragmentation was only modulation, and what seemed like a separate self was only a ripple in what was always whole. What was missing was the seeing. Chapter 13. The Edgeless Razor. In the contemplative traditions of humanity, certain tools of inquiry have long served to cut through illusion and reveal what remains when the false dissolves. In Advaita Vedanta, there is neti neti. In Zen, the koan. In early Buddhism, the deconstruction of aggregates. In Dzogchen, the direct pointing out instructions that leave nothing to grasp. And in the living presence of Ramana Maharshi, a question as sharp as any blade was offered to sincere seekers. Who am I? Each of these inquiries does not ask for belief. They ask for looking. Not toward an answer, but toward the unravelling of the one who asks. The edgeless razor arises in that same spirit. It is not a method. It is not a belief. It is not a path to follow. It is the unfolding of a single, uncompromising principle. If it is known to me, it cannot be me. This does not need any explanation. It only needs honesty. If something is observed, it cannot be the observer. If something changes, it cannot be what is always present. This principle is not a teaching. It is what anyone can see when attention turns inward without reaching for conclusion. To appreciate what the razor reveals, it helps to walk the path it cuts. The process begins outwardly with what is most obvious, the world of form. Trees, bodies, and buildings are clearly objects. They are seen. They change. They are not you. Next, attention turns inward, to sensations, thoughts, and emotions. Each of these arises, persists for a time, and fades. You know them. You witness their comings and goings. Therefore, they too cannot be you. Deeper still, memory, personality, personal history, the subtle narrative threads that compose what we usually call me. These too are objects in awareness. They are experienced. They are remembered. They shift, evolve, and dissolve. They are not the knower. Even the sense of I am, the raw beingness prior to identity, is seen to arise and be known. Even this cannot be what you are. And then, in a moment of quiet clarity, something stunning is glimpsed. Everything you know, everything you could possibly point to, whether gross or subtle, is not you. This realization can be deepened through a sequence of direct recognitions. Time is known to me. I must be outside of time. Space is known to me. I must be beyond space. Perception is known to me. I must precede perception. Thought is known to me. I must not be thought. Emotion is known to me. I must not be emotion. Body is known to me. I must not be the body. The sense of I am is known to me. I must be prior to the sense of being. What remains, when all that is known is relinquished, is not a blank, not absence, but something entirely ungraspable and yet unmistakably present, the very field in which all knowing appears. The razor functions not by seeking truth, but by letting go of falsehood. It does not construct a world view. It does not add concepts. It simply declines to identify with what is seen. A thought arises, such as, I am unworthy, or I must succeed. And the razor does not argue. It does not refute. It simply sees. That thought is known. It moves. It fades. It is not what I am. Over time, this seeing becomes more subtle. What once felt like an observer behind experience is revealed to be just another subtle formation. The last illusion to fall is the one who seeks. And when that too is seen, what remains is not an improved self. It is the absence of self, not emptiness, not void, but awareness, unbound, unheld, ungrasped. The razor is not a path. It does not require belief. It does not depend on culture or tradition. It needs no teacher. It needs only the willingness to look directly. It is radical in its refusal to grant reality to anything that comes and goes. For this reason, it dissolves even itself. The one who applies the razor is also known. The final cut is self-negation. What remains is not another position. It is the end of positioning. Some habits of thought may continue. The sense of self may flicker in familiar ways. But it is no longer confused with what is real. It is no longer believed. The appearance of separation may persist for a time, but its foundation has been seen through. In that seeing, everything changes, even if nothing does. Even the metaphor of the razor fades. It was never a thing. It was never possessed. It is not a tool to be passed down. It is the natural capacity of awareness to reflect without grasping, to see without becoming, to know without dividing. The insight that gave rise to these reflections, that what we call self is a pattern of resonance within the field of awareness, was itself just another wave. It formed, it pointed, it passed. What remains is not the idea. It is not the razor. It is the seeing, quiet, unclaimed. This book has not taught anything. It has not presented a philosophy. It has simply traced the outlines of what cannot be defined. A gesture, a clearing, a disappearance. The razor was never mine. It was never yours. It is simply what is revealed when nothing is held. And perhaps now, as the last words settle, you may feel it not as something new, but as something already here. Not the seeker, not the path, not even the seeing, just what has always been, already here, already whole. Returning to grace. 2.5 years ago, I found myself lying in a hospital bed, not with answers, but with anguish. A deep mental storm had pulled me under, and my body followed. Exploratory surgery, psychiatric observation, 3 weeks on a stabilization unit. I had harmed myself because I believed my thoughts. And I believed my thoughts because I did not yet know they were only thoughts. At that time, the phrase, "all is grace," would have sounded cruel, even absurd. Yet that very phrase is now something I chant regularly at the temple. It forms part of a familiar and beloved melody sung during services. A refrain from a tradition that places grace at the center of its doctrine. Won Buddhism teaches that grace is not an external reward. It is the natural unfolding of the Tao, of awareness, of what is. But when I first encountered that chant, I had no idea what grace was. It sounded beautiful, but it felt meaningless. And yet, something had been planted. Before any of this began, I had already been studying Advaita Vedanta, a teaching that speaks of the formless source, the witness, the non-dual self. It had opened something in me, but the understanding was still intellectual, still partial. About a year after I began attending the temple, I encountered the Tao Te Ching. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. Its simplicity belied its piercing power. I began to see that truth was not confined to one lineage or language. Later still, Christian mysticism arrived, first through Meister Eckhart, then through contemplative prayer, and I began to see with increasing clarity the common message. Many fingers pointing to the same moon. Even in the hospital, a seed began to germinate. A quiet realization took root. I could not go on living in the same isolation and anxiety that had dominated my inner life. I would have to learn to meet people, to let discomfort arise, to not run. It took nearly a full year to understand what grace truly meant. A few weeks after my release, an email arrived from a local temple I had long forgotten. I clicked. I watched their year in review video, and something unexpected welled up. I spoke aloud, to no one. Wow, look at all those people. I must go there. And that night, I did. It was my first Tuesday evening meditation, my first time sitting in silence with others, my first bow to another human being in a long, long time. And it was the beginning of my true recovery. Not back to who I was, but forward into what I had always been. Within months, I was meditating twice a day. Not perfectly, not heroically, but sincerely. I began to see how the mind invents disturbance from the raw material of false belief. I began to see how suffering reinforces itself when we take appearance to be self. I also began to bow, not just to others, but one morning, without planning, to my own reflection in the bathroom mirror. I smiled, I said, "Hello, John," and I meant it. I used to avoid mirrors. Now I greet what appears in them, not as ego, but as expression, not as illusion, but as fluctuation. And that smile has never really left. By the time I travelled to Zambia to visit the school that had somehow come into being through me, I understood that grace was not a poetic term. It was reality. The children did not receive my love. They were love. So was the soil. So was the silence. So was I. Love, I saw, is not a current that moves between subjects. It is the substance of the field, and the more it flows through, the more it flows, because nothing blocks it. There is no one left to hold it back. And in that realization, the circle completed. The hospital, the temple, the school, the mirror, the teachings I once resisted, now seen with new eyes. All the same wave, Eastern and Western, ancient and modern, all dissolving in the same clear current. All is grace. It always was. Epilogue. The circle turns. There is no final chapter. What was written here is not the truth, but a gesture toward it. You may feel drawn to start again, to revisit a line or a chapter, not for answers, but for resonance. You may even find that what once seemed profound now falls away like old skin. Good, let it. The wave has passed through. And yet, something remains. Not as a thought, not as an insight, but as a quiet seeing, a softness in the gaze, a loosening of the grip, a returning to where you never left. The point was never to escape life, or to master it. The point was to see clearly, to live lightly, to bow without drama or urgency to what is. Not as someone who knows, but as no one at all. Even karma, once seen through this lens, softens. What appeared as burden becomes pattern. What seemed like destiny becomes motion. No longer a law, but a dance. Energy shaped by mind. now freed from ownership. The wave still moves, but it moves without a name. The circle turns. And if you are very quiet, you may hear it even now. A whisper behind all appearances. All is grace.